Welcome, everyone. I'm Lee Kump, the John Leone Dean of the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences. I'm honored and privileged to bring you tonight's program, a conversation with Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, author of How to Be an Anti-Racist. This event launches the College of Earth and Mineral Sciences 125th anniversary series. As we look back and celebrate our accomplishments, we also look forward to the additional work we want to do. An important part of that is building a more equitable and anti-racist college and university. From our very earliest planning to host Dr. Kendi, we've had tremendous excitement across the university, and particularly from my colleagues on the Council of Academic Deans. We are thankful for their support in bringing this program to you tonight. You'll see the full list of our co-sponsors on your screen. You'll also see a chat box on your screen where you can pose a question. Thanks to WPSU for hosting this event. Our moderator tonight is Shireen Stanford. Shireen is the Content Strategy Director at WPSU, responsible for developing and implementing the strategy for the station's original productions across digital, radio, and television. She is also a moderator and an on-camera host and serves as one of the hosts of WPSU's long-form interview program, Take Note. For many years, Stanford was a journalist, producer, director, and writer with a career spanning print, web, TV, and independent film. Her work has garnered 4 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards, a George Foster Peabody Award, and the Cine Golden Eagle Award. Shireen?
Thank you, Dean Kump, and thank you to everyone in our audience this evening for joining us for this conversation with Professor Ibram X. Kendi. Ibram X. Kendi is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Boston University and the founding director of the BU Center for Anti-Racist Research. He is a contributing writer at The Atlantic and the CBS News Racial Justice contributor. Kendi is the 2020-2021 Francis B. Cashin Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard University. He's the author of many books, including Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction. He has also authored 3 #1 New York Times bestsellers, including How to Be an Anti-Racist, which we'll be discussing this evening. In 2020, Time magazine named Kendi one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Professor Kendi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're going to start with our conversation with Professor Kendi. And as Dean Kump mentioned, we're also looking forward to getting your questions toward the end of the discussion. So please feel free to share your questions in the chat as they come to you. Professor Kendi, I really wanted to start by asking you why you felt it was necessary to write this book and why now?
Well, I thought it was necessary because people asked, and I know it's not a profound reason, but indeed, when I wrote Stamped from the Beginning, which was this narrative history of racist ideas, anti-Black racist ideas in America, I also decided that I wanted the narrative to chronicle the history of ideas that had historically challenged those racist ideas. And I knew I couldn't call those ideas not racist ideas because typically the progenitors of those ideas were self-identifying them as not racist. And so I ended up deciding to call those ideas anti-racist ideas and really sort of show this history of this clash between racist and anti-racist ideas. And so when I went around speaking about Stamped from the Beginning, which came out in 2016, I would urge people to adopt more anti-racist ideas. I would urge people to be anti-racist. And people would be like, what are you talking about? I'm not racist. What do you mean, being anti-racist? How can I be an anti-racist? And the more people asked me that question, how can I be anti-racist, the more I realized I needed to answer in book form.
And you touched on this, but what's the issue you see with someone saying, I'm not racist, or using the term colorblind, which you also talk about in your book? What's the issue with those terms?
Well, first, I think it's important for us to understand the ways in which terms either emerge or the context in which they're used. And so as it relates to the term colorblind, this term largely entered into the American sort of common vocabulary in 1997. And it was in reaction to President Clinton at the time seeking to lead a national conversation on race. And so the opponents, those who were like, we don't need to talk about race, were colorblind. The nation is colorblind. Indeed, stop pulling the race card. Those two terms, race card and colorblind, sort of emerged or became quite prominent in the way the term anti-racist has this year in 1997. And so I don't think many people who use that term realize that this term was popularized to eliminate conversations on race and racism. And indeed, typically those who say they're colorblind are saying they don't need to engage in or even strive to be anti-racist. The term, though, I should say the phrase, I'm not racist, the context in which that's normally used is when someone does something or says something that indeed is racist, and they're challenged for it, or they're called on it, or they're diagnosed as being racist. And what's the common response of an American? To say, no, I'm not racist. No matter what they just said, no matter what they just did, no matter what they're not doing. When Americans are described as being racist, the common response is I'm not racist. And the reason for that is because just as people are taught to be racist, people are taught to deny that they're being racist. And the sound of that denial is, I'm not racist. While to be anti-racist is actually to have the courage and the vulnerability and the willingness to actually admit those times in which we're being racist. Why? So that we can strive to be anti-racist.
And, you're speaking obviously at a university, you're based at a university. Can you talk a little bit about how a university like Penn State can be working to enact anti-racist policies? What are some steps or things they should be looking at in terms of becoming a more anti-racist place?
I think not only should the university be looking at its permanent body, meaning, you have universities that claim they're diverse based on the student body, and students are transient. They don't want to assess it based on their administrators or the faculty, or even the staff. And so I think obviously ensuring that the policies and practices of the university is yielding equity and as opposed to inequities, but also, the curriculum itself, because fundamentally, these are teaching and research institutions. And so what are we teaching our students? Are we teaching our students that the problem is people? Are we teaching our students that racial inequities are caused by the inferior cultures or behaviors of particular racial groups? Or are we teaching our students that the problem is conditions and policies and structures? And as researchers, what is our basic assumption? Is our basic assumption that people could be the problem? So we're trying to investigate, okay, what's wrong with Black people? Or is our basic assumption there's nothing wrong with Black people? And so let me figure out what policies are actually causing Black people to die at 2 times the rates of white people from COVID-19.
Yeah, and I think some of the concepts in the book, people might understand on sort of an abstract level and are trying to, imagine in a really concrete way. Can you give an example in society or, things that you're working towards of both something that is a racist policy and then a successful sort of anti-racist policy that you've seen?
Okay, so let's, in Louisville, Kentucky, there was a policy that gave police officers the ability to execute no-knock warrants. And those no-knock warrants were disproportionately used in poor communities, in Black communities. The same no-knock warrant that was used in the murder of Breonna Taylor. And obviously, after her murder, activists in the community sought to eliminate that policy that was disproportionately harming, Black people, and indeed they have succeeded, and so that's sort of one example of the removal, of a racist policy, or even, I think, to speak more about the Affordable Care Act reduced the uninsurance rates of both Black and Latinx people by double digits, about 11%. But it hasn't eliminated, and Black and Latinx people still are less likely to be insured and more likely to be underinsured. And so that's how, if you institute a Medicare for All policy, that can eliminate that disparity. And thereby it's even more anti-racist than the current Affordable Care Act.
I'm sure, since you said, people asked you the question, how can I be anti-racist? So people who have read the book or are planning to, one of the things I think I hear often is people feeling like they're overwhelmed now that they don't know what the first step is to take. What are some sort of practical ways that you help people thinking through how they can work personally towards being anti-racist?
Well, I think there's this self-reflection, and there's actually been some incredible workbooks that have come out this year. So there's a workbook called, Me and White Supremacy. I came out with a workbook called Be Anti-Racist, which really allows the person to really systematically reflect on themselves and really sort of take this journey to be anti-racist. But we're not really seeking to just to transform ourselves for the sake of transforming ourselves. Every individual can ask themselves, what do they have to give? Do you have time? Do you have expertise? Do you have a platform? Do you have funds? What do you have to give to those national or local racial justice organizations that are on the front line fighting racist power, in policy, and give what you have?
I want to turn to the election. You describe in the book in really great detail some of the voter suppression tactics that were happening in the 2000 election in Florida, and on what you call destroyed Black votes, and similar tactics in Ohio later. Are there any similarities to anything that you've seen happen in this election? It felt to me like there were some parallels in terms of attempts at voter suppression that people were talking about. Did you see any parallels with this election?
Without question. Indeed, I recently wrote an essay in The Atlantic that was entitled The Campaign of Voter Subtraction. And I made the case that, unlike previous Republican parties or other major political parties in which voter suppression was one sort of tool in the toolbox to maintain political power or gain political power. In this election, for the Republican Party, it was the tool in the toolbox, to the point in which literally this election was between GOP voter suppression policies and American voters. That was the decisive sort of conflict. That was the decisive battle between voter suppression policies, and people literally trying to vote. And so those voter suppression policies, which had been instituted long ago, like the purging of voters, like the voter ID laws, like the rolling back of early voting, continued, this year, in which GOP officials from Pennsylvania to Texas tried to figure out ways to limit mail-in voting, or even make it harder to engage in mail-in voting. And then, ironically, those very folks who tried to steal the election then turned around and claimed the election has been stolen from them.
I think, historians tend to have a very different view of the world, in that you've seen sort of things happen before and seen patterns over time. I'm wondering if this time in history that we hear a lot of people talking about is very divided and feeling different than maybe, recent years. Does this time in history remind you of any other time that you've studied in this country's history?
I think probably the best analogy is probably the 1850s. And the 1850s was a decade in which you not only had slaveholders who were among the richest and most powerful people in the world, but you also, on the abolitionist side, had people like Moses, and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, and abolitionists along the abolitionist belt of counties from Boston all the way over to Ohio, in which people were increasingly gaining sort of political power and being increasingly active in resisting slaveholding, and even calling for the immediate end of slavery itself, which, of course, for slaveholders was literally Armageddon. And that clash of slaveholders who were trying to spread slavery nationally and abolitionists who were trying to end slavery nationally, of course, led to searing divisions, to the point in which there were literally people. And so I think that it's important for us to know that we have been there before, just as even the 1870s, also is a time of memory in which you literally had Black folks who had been able to gain the right to vote in the South, who had elected their politicians, and you had a resurgent white supremacist South who was using all manners to suppress the Black vote, to kill Black voters and politicians, and to really devastate the Reconstruction Amendments, folks who literally said, we want the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments to become dead letters. And by 1876, they had largely succeeded.
I'm wondering if there's some ideas in the book that you've gotten maybe the most pushback on, or things that are the hardest for people to sort of accept. Are there certain ones that people all the time want to ask you and question or have a hard time with?
So I think for white folks, it's been very difficult to recognize two things. First, that the construct of not racist is actually a form of racist denial. I think that's been very difficult for people, since folks have identified for so long as being not racist. And I think concomitantly with that, it's been difficult for white folks who hold assimilationist ideas, these ideas that suggest, no, we're all created equal, but it is the case that Black people are in some ways culturally or behaviorally inferior, that indeed they come from these broken homes and broken communities with broken families and broken schools, but they can be fixed. And I'm working to fix you. I'm working to save you. That these assimilationist ideas or racist ideas, I think it's been very difficult for white folks to accept that. And there's a constant sort of pushback, and there's a constant case to be made, or people are making cases that no, racial, cultural hierarchy that's not a racist perspective, or claiming that a group is behaviorally deficient. That's not a racist idea. That's just true. It's been very difficult. And I think for folks of color, too, it's been difficult to really to accept the construct that we're all either being racist or anti-racist, even people of color who imagine they can't be racist. So just as you have white folks who say they're not racist, you have folks of color who say they can't be racist. So everybody is like, I'm not contributing to white supremacy. Everybody's saying that. So it's been difficult for everybody to accept that at times when they are up to accept that those times in which they are not actively challenging racism and white supremacy, they're being racist.
Yeah, I think that's probably, if, looking at some of the critique, I think that's probably the toughest one for people of color to think about, or it's one of the biggest critiques I've seen of this idea that, but we can't be racist because we don't hold the power. And you directly address that. I wonder if you can share what your response is to that argument.
Yeah, well, first, let's talk about Black folks. So the question that people typically ask is, can Black people as a collective group be racist? And that's actually not the question that I'm asking. Indeed, I would argue that Black people as a collective group have been engaged in anti-racism historically. When you look at the fact that Black people collectively have been the foremost champions of policies that can create equity and justice, when you look at Black folks as a collective group have been champions of ideas of racial sort of equality. When you look at the fact that Black folks have been at the forefront of anti-racist movements. But it's a different question. And the question that I'm asking is, can an individual who is Black be racist? And does an individual have power? That's a different question than whether Black people collectively have as much power, let's say, as white people, when we all know that that's not the case. But, does Clarence Thomas have power? Does that Black police chief have power? Does that Black attorney general who freed Breonna Taylor's killers have power? Do each and every one of us have the power to resist racist policies? Do each and every one of us have the power to say, no, there's nothing wrong with Black people? Do we have the power to consume ideas that there is indeed something wrong with Black people? And so what actually happens when we ask the question about the individuals have the power to resist. You have some individuals who have the power to execute or manage policies. And you have Black folks who are like, nah, this policy is harmful to Black people, so I'm not going to actually carry it out in the way it's supposed to be carried out. That person's being anti-racist. And then you have Black individuals who are in policy-making positions and who are using their policy-making power to push and defend policies that create equity and justice for all. Then you have other individuals who are Black, who are in positions of power, who use their powerful positions to support policies that reinforce racism out of their own personal self-interest. And to imagine that person, that mayor, that congresswoman, that police chief has no power, to imagine that they're not specifically supporting white supremacist policies because it's going to advance their career is simply not to imagine reality. And so I'm saying that no, whenever anyone, no matter the color of their skin, is upholding racism, they're being racist.
You include a lot of yourself in this. It's, part memoir as well. And we see the evolution of your way of thinking throughout the book. Were there some parts, or what were some of the most challenging parts to reveal to such a broad audience?
All of the above. I mean, I'm quite private. And so I think and also I'm just, even we were just talking about sort of Black people and like what drives me, and I don't know whether you even, so people see this, like what drives me and what has always driven me is really my just deep love of Black people. And so I'm going to defend Black people no matter who is saying there's something wrong with Black people, whether they're white, whether they're not white. If somebody's saying or pushing policies that are harming Black people, to me, they're a problem. And so for me to accept that there were times in my life when I was trafficking in anti-Blackness, and for me to project that to the world, I mean, it was just very, very difficult, to do. Especially, as somebody who believed that I loved Black people, who believed that I was committed to Black people, who believed that I was committed to humanity, when in reality I was not. To accept that and project that and to detail some of the most shameful moments of my life to the world was very, very difficult to do. But I also thought it was very, very important to do, because to me, to be anti-racist is to have the willingness to admit and to be vulnerable, and which is the opposite of saying, oh, I'm not racist no matter what, or I can't be racist. It's no, indeed, I am harming. I am not contributing to the dismantling of racism. I was not contributing to that. If anything, I was sustaining it, all the while imagining that I was contributing, or should I say I was challenging it. That's how we then reckon with, okay, what can I do to challenge it? We have to first reckon and admit the ways in which we are indeed not challenging racism to begin the process in which we are.
There's a quote in the book, and you talk a decent amount about courage, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to do what is right in the face of it. I think you quote an anonymous philosopher. Are there times when you're scared doing this work? And if so, what gives you courage to keep going?
So, yeah, I mean, it's not easy doing this work, as you know. I mean, I think, I've been subjected to many people who not just are deliberately misrepresenting what I'm saying and then attacking their own misrepresentations, people who are deliberately discrediting me personally, but also threatening my life and threatening the lives of people around me. And so it's not easy, to be the source of, or really be, to deal with so many attacks. But at the same time, I try to be focused on those folks who are grieving because their father died of COVID-19. And if he lived in a different zip code or he was another race, he would still be living. I try to be focused, on that Black mother who's being evicted from her home and is trying to figure out where she's going to go, with her children. I try to stay focused on that talented, Black boy who is perceived of as a behavioral problem, but indeed he's bored because he's not being challenged. And I think that then squares me to focus that really this has nothing to do with me and everything to do with, relieving Black people, relieving Native people, even preventing white people from being manipulated so that they can join in this larger struggle for a different world.
What benefit does this country get from having a more equitable society? I mean, you lay out that the reason that these ideas persist is because there's a self-interest involved. So there's some people who do benefit from having these inequities. So what benefit does the country get from having a more equitable society? And so why should people be invested in trying to reach this goal?
Well, I mean, let's take something as simple as, anyone on this call, if we had a different type of society that was more equitable, if we had a different type of political system where we completely removed money from politics, where it was really I think anyone on this call would be able to run for office. And if we had a different type of society, we would, healthcare would be a human right for every single one of us. If we had a different type of society, we would all have a basic income. If we had a different type of society, we wouldn't be leading the world in the number of people being killed by police and the number of people being incarcerated and the number of people dying of COVID-19. If we had a different, type of society, we wouldn't have so much economic inequality in which you've had so many, particularly low and middle income white folks who have been manipulated into voting for elected officials who then turned around and supported sort of corporate power or other forms of power that then allowed for those middle income and even working class people for their wages, for their salaries to not grow at the same levels as CEOs. All the while, those elected officials were telling those working class white folks and middle income folks, the reason why you're struggling economically is not because of me. It's because of those Black and brown people. It's because those Latinx people are invading this country and taking your jobs. It's because those Black criminals or those Muslim terrorists. And so can you imagine if people weren't so easily manipulated by racist fears? Can you imagine if a president wasn't able to just say law and order and I'm going to defend you, and 70 million people would just suddenly, vote for him? Obviously, it wasn't that sort of simple, but I think that it's important for us to realize that those of us who are striving to be anti-racist, we're striving to create equity and justice for every single person, for all groups.
One of the things that you said was a big revelation for you was that the source of racist ideas was self-interest, not ignorance and hate. So that people creating racist policies for their own self-interest and were using racist policies to support that. So for you, why was that such an important realization?
Because historically, when we thought about the solution, when we thought about eliminating racism, it was based on our conception of the cradle of racism itself. So we had been led to believe that really the source, the cradle of racism was ignorance and hate, that you had people who were ignorant and hateful producing these racist ideas. And then these racist ideas were then causing powerful people to institute racist policies. So then we were like, oh, you know what? If we just educate people and encourage people to love thy neighbor, then that will then eliminate the racist ideas and thereby the policies. But what if it was the other way around? What if slaveholders were enslaving people to make money? And what if, because of anti-slavery activity, they had to even, at the founding of this country, they had to justify those policies that allowed for Black slavery by claiming that those Black people should be enslaved because they're the cursed descendants of Ham. So in other words, they were responding to or justifying those racist policies that were benefiting them. And then what if people started consuming those racist ideas? And that's how they became ignorant and hateful. So what that means is, particularly for those folks in positions of power, we're not going to educate them away so they can believe that there's no voter fraud. They already know there's no voter fraud, right? And they created the concept of voter fraud knowing that there wasn't one, but they had to justify these voter suppression policies because they benefited them politically. So what that means is we have to have a political and a power response, that we're engaged in a power struggle. And we need to drive those people from power and change policy. And that's how we can then sort of get at the source, of this racism problem.
I want to, as I expected, we are getting a lot of questions. We're not going to be able to probably get to all of them, but I want to ask you some that we're getting from the audience. The first one is, what can we do to best educate our young people on the importance of anti-racism when they're being raised in racist environments?
The very fact that they are being raised in an anti-racist environment should tell us that when we raise our children to be anti-racist, we're actually protecting them from that larger racist environment. And so to not actively seek to, for us to not actively seek to educate our children to be anti-racist, we are exposing them. We're essentially stripping them naked and sending them out, into this world in which they're obviously going to be clothed, in racist ideas. And so I think we should see it based on the question as a protective mechanism that, we can protect that little Black boy to say to him, you know what, there's nothing wrong with you because of the color of your skin. We can protect that Latinx girl by saying there's nothing wrong with you because of the texture, of your hair, or because of your language, or because of your accent. Just as we can protect that white boy, that little white boy, by saying there's nothing right about you. There's nothing better about you because of the color of your skin or your eyes. And indeed, if you're in an area where the wealthier side of town is predominantly white and the poorer side of town is predominantly Black, you can actively teach that white boy also that, these white folks, and this is a white parent saying this to their white child, us white folks do not necessarily have more because we are more. Just as that parent, that Black parent of that Black girl in that Black side of town can actively teach them, these Black folks, we don't have less because we are less. And then that opens you up to then talk about policies, rules with those children, which then allows them to conceptualize why one group has more than the other, because otherwise they're just going to assume that people have less because they are less, and which we actively teach them, about rules. And they know rules. They know that their bedtime is 8 p.m. and they hate that rule and they think that rule is unjust and they've been fighting that rule for years. And so they know what an unjust rule is. And I'm sure each of our kids can articulate the unjust rules. And of course, we can compare that to racist policies.
So a few of the questions are getting to this idea that we touched on a little bit of the polarization that seems to exist in this country and how to even begin the kind of conversation that needs to happen when people don't seem to want to listen to each other. Do you have thoughts on even people starting to have those conversations when it seems like there's not even a good starting point, when people aren't willing to listen?
So I understand. So let's first understand the context of what's happening. So there are two types of, not to overly simplify, but we don't have that much time. There are folks who just don't know, but they think they know, but they're open, right, to hearing new knowledge, new evidence, new information. So with those folks, we just have to make a better case. But then there are other folks who they're more closed-minded. And to be closed-minded is essentially to be addicted to a particular set of ideas, to a set of racist ideas, let's say. So what that means is when a person is addicted, they have an addiction to a substance, to the substance of bigotry, we can't essentially go and tell them they're addicted. They have to realize that for themselves. And how we get them to realize that for themselves, obviously, it's very difficult. We can encourage them. And I think it's different. It's different for different people, how we can get them to overcome their denial. But I wanted to understand the context, because I think we have to assess, okay, is this a person who's addicted? So do I really need to get them to overcome their denial? Or is this person who's open, they just have, I just need to make a better case. And that, I think, will give us insight into how we can respond.
Yeah. Another question is about how professors can be anti-racist in the classroom. And they say this can be related to changes in curriculum or ways of teaching. Just what your thoughts are on how professors can be anti-racist.
I mean, I would encourage professors to, if depending on the subject that they're teaching, to really transform, or I should say, ensure that they can create a project that allows students to apply their knowledge to a racial problem, which they're applying their knowledge to figure out, what policies and practices are the true source, of that inequity or injustice. I mean, it really, of course, depends on the subject, but the more we can bring students into the praxis of figuring out in real time what is the actual cause, of Black people dying at 3 times the rates of white people from police violence, the more we're essentially teaching them the process of being anti-racist.
Yeah, and there's some question about this overall structure that we know that the country has that's dealing with, it's sort of trying to work within a system. So one of the questions is, can you be anti-racist working within a racist organization? What are some ways to do that when the structure itself, the institution itself, is in itself a racist institution?
So yes, I mean, it really depends on, are you upholding, so an institution is not only, of course, its people, but it's even more so its policymakers, but more so its policies and its practices. So the question for the individual is, what are you generally doing? Are you generally challenging those policies and practices that are racist? Are you generally just doing nothing, which is allowing those policies and practices to persist, which is allowing the status quo of racism to persist, which is you being complicit in that status quo? And so really that's the question that we should be asking ourselves. I don't want people to just assume that because you live in a racist nation, that means you are inherently always going to be racist. No. For instance, my ancestors were enslaved, and they figured out ways to consistently and constantly resist their enslavement, such to the point that scholars of slavery, recognizing this consistent and common resistance, have stopped using the term slave. And we've started using the term enslaved to really connote that even slaveholders were not able to successfully make a slave. Just as even though we live in a racist system where we're constantly being sort of taught and encouraged and incentivized to be racist, that there are individuals within this system that are still resisting.
Yeah. Another question is, what role do you see acknowledging Native American population and America's true history, examples of institutional land acknowledgements, in moving forward and being anti-racist?
So, I mean, obviously, I think that it is important for us to not focus on, let's say, one form of racism. I don't think we should just say that that we should necessarily focus on anti-Black racism or anti-Latinx racism or anti-Native racism or anti-Asian racism, or even and what that means is, like, I'm a scholar of anti-Black racism, but I'm not going to sit up here and not recognize the ways in which anti-Black racism has really intersected with or flowed along the same lines of anti-Native racism. I'm not going to then stand up here and say that I still am not, that I'm sort of anti-racist as it relates to Native people. I still have so much work, to do. I think land acknowledgements are extremely sort of helpful, because I think it's important for people to recognize, indeed, that this nation was not only built on the slave trading and slaveholding, but in settler colonialism. I wouldn't necessarily use it as a litmus test. So somebody, gave a land acknowledgement, so that means they're committed to really valuing the history of Native people, because they're people who give the land acknowledgement and then go root for the Redskins right after it.
I want to touch on, someone writes a quote that says that it's from your book that the only way to be anti-racist is to presently discriminate. You can tell me if that's an actual quote. And how can we beat discrimination with more discrimination is the question.
So I actually think it's important to actually read the text, and there are many ways in which people take one sentence, completely take it out of context, and then say that anti-racism is really racism. So I would really encourage people. I believe that discussion is either in chapter 1 or chapter 2. But what's important for you to know, and this really speaks to the larger issue, is that when we're thinking about policies, discrimination, when we're thinking about the way in which we're defining terms, we should focus on outcome. So is something leading to more inequity or equity? And so in other words, when, let's say if I have one child, but let's say if I had a second child, and one of my children, I gave both of my children, 4 cookies. And one of my children took 3 cookies from the other child, and now she had 7 cookies. Did I add that right? Yeah. Now she has 7 cookies, and the other child has 1 cookie. And then how do I equalize the situation if I don't have no more cookies? That's the question. So some people would say, me taking 3 cookies back and giving it to the original child, that's technically a discrimination. That's technically discrimination. And so some are like, no, that's reverse discrimination. That's racist. But indeed, you're equalizing the situation. And so that's a very different thing than obviously what that originally happened when that child took. And so I think, again, I really want you to read that section, because it really speaks to really even the concept of discrimination. We need to think about it much more broadly, in which people regularly discriminate in ways that they don't consider it to be discrimination in a non-racial capacity. But then when it comes to race, anyway, let me not read the book.
So that actually is going to lead me to a question that I had too about what work you're doing at the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research, because we're getting a lot of questions about making sure that universities aren't sort of just doing performative, like bringing someone like you to talk, but also, then having racist policies on the book. So I'm curious about what work you're doing at BU in the Center for Anti-Racist Research and what you're hoping to get from that research.
Well, I can speak broadly about our mission, and really what we are really organizing researchers across BU who study racism, and even across New England who study racism, to come together on teams and through initiatives and programs that we're devising that will not only collect and track and analyze racial sort of data for racial disparities, but also seek to understand the policies and practices behind those disparities and even injustices, and not really stop there as some scholars do, for those researchers to then connect with policy experts who can then essentially create innovative corrective anti-racist policies that are researched and evidence sort of based. But then for those scholars working with those policy folks to not stop there, for those scholars, for their research and even the policy innovation to be translated for everyday people so people can understand the solution and the problem, so we can shift the narrative so that scholarly research and expertise is at the forefront of shaping the American mind on racial matters. But not to stop there, but also to work very closely with advocacy groups and grassroots organizations on the ground who are fighting to institute anti-racist policy. So ultimately, what I'm speaking to is really the four pillars of the center in our work, which is research, policy, narrative, and advocacy.
There's a question I'm wondering if you'll be able to get to, because I think it's maybe a little misunderstanding about, can you elaborate on how COVID-19 is racist? They don't understand how a virus can be racist. And I think you're talking about how COVID-19 disproportionately affects communities of color, but I'm wondering if you can address that question and what that has to do with race.
Oh, what does COVID-19 have to do with race? Well, I mean, I think according to the COVID racial data tracker, for the last 7 months, when we've been tracking and states have been releasing racial data, Black people and Native people and Latinx people have been infected and killed at higher rates. Last I checked, Black people were dying at 2.3 times the rates of white people. That's called a racial disparity. And then when we seek to explain why are Black people and Native and Latinx people being infected at disproportionately high rates and even dying? It's not because, let's say, Black people are not washing their hands. It's not because Black people don't take care of themselves, which then causes them to be, have more sort of pre-existing conditions. Actually, studies show the reason why Black people are dying at higher rates than white people from COVID-19 is because Black people are less likely to be able to work from home. It's because Black people have less access to health insurance. It's because Black people are more likely to live in what's called trauma deserts, where they don't have access to high quality, life-saving trauma care. It's because Black people are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher levels of air and water pollutions. And then when we look at why is those things the case, the answer is a series of historic and present racist policies.
Lots of people want to thank you for speaking tonight. And this is an interesting question about whether or not of places in the world that have been effectively anti-racist, if such a place exists.
I mean, there are aspects of different places. For instance, obviously we know that South Africa, after apartheid, engaged in racial reconciliation, which this nation has never done around slavery and Jim Crow and in the continuing sort of police violence. But even still, some studies show that white South Africans are richer now than they were during apartheid. And some studies show that Black South Africans are poorer on average. And so even the dismantling of a political apartheid did not dismantle an economic apartheid. Or you take a place like Germany, if you're thinking about a country that of course was the site of the Nazi Holocaust and of course a site of anti-Semitism. So what Germany did is not only did they start paying reparations to the victims of the Holocaust, but they also started teaching children as early as kindergarten, about Nazism and the Holocaust to ensure that it never sort of happened, again. And also there aren't any monuments to Hitler, last I checked, in Germany or any other Nazi official in the way that there's so many Confederate and Ku Klux Klan and slaveholding monuments, in this country. But then again, Germany doesn't collect racial data. And so it's hard for Afro-Germans and other folks of color to officially see that they're on the lower end of disparities, in the way we can in the United States.
Someone has an interesting question about you're open about talking about changing your middle name from Henry to Solani, and someone wants to know if you would go back and think it was worthwhile to bring a new and anti-racist legacy to your original middle name.
I mean, certainly that was possible. Yeah, I mean, that could have been interesting. But at the end of the day, I just could not swear. I wasn't certainly named after Prince Henry. For those who aren't familiar with Prince Henry, the navigator who really pioneered the transatlantic slave trade, which really pioneered the system of racism. I wasn't named after Henry. I was named after an ancestor who was obviously named Henry, but I just can't get that connection sort of out of my mind.
Yeah. How do you respond to people who don't believe that there is concrete evidence for systemic racism?
What I would say is there's concrete evidence of racial disparities and inequities. And there's only one other explanation for why those disparities and inequities persist. And that's there's something inferior about Black and Brown and Native people. And so to believe that systemic racism doesn't exist is to believe that racial hierarchy does exist.
I wonder, this is a question I had, and I've seen it come up a couple of times in the question. Towards the end of the book, you talk about the need for hope, that we have to believe that this country can change in order to do this work. And so I'm wondering what gives you hope and keeps you invested in this work.
It's more philosophical. I don't necessarily look for certain things that are happening in society as much as I just know philosophically, how can we do the incredibly hard work that would be necessary to bring about change if we don't even believe change is possible? And so to me, it's more a philosophical recognition that you have to believe change is possible in order to bring it about.
And you talk about the importance of sort of this continual self-assessment to an anti-racism being a continual process. So I'm curious as a personal for you, how's that work going? Is that something that you still find yourself looking to and saying, oh, that was a moment of me having a racist thought or a racist idea? Or is that work that you feel like, you're pretty good and on the way to that?
Oh, I still have racist thoughts. So yeah, it's certainly something that's ongoing, in which even I have to check myself. And I do.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, what are we're going to wrap up here, just final thoughts that you have. I think for a lot of people, maybe reading your book was going to be eye-opening in some ways. There's some hard questions we have to ask ourselves. I'm wondering what sort of final thoughts you want to leave with our audience as they sort of grapple with what the work is that they can do or need to do as we sort of move forward to try to have a more just and equitable society.
Well, it's just that we're not going to create a just and equitable society. We're not going to transform our society unless we're willing to put in the hard work to do so, including via transforming ourselves. And so we have to be anti-racist so we can create an anti-racist society. And we don't have any alternative, because literally we should know, especially based on 2020, that our society is dying of bigotry and racism. And so we literally have to save human life.
Dr. Kendi, thank you so much for being with us tonight and sharing your time with us. I want to thank everyone for joining us and for your great questions. We can never, ever get to all the questions, but we appreciate you. And thank you so much. Have a great night.